So there are a couple of questions regarding absorption meditations. And this one in particular is asking, is the knowing that we practice during meditation similar or different to the concentration or absorption on a single meditation object? So just to touch on the topic of these absorptions, which are also called jhanas sometimes. They're quite unusual states of meditation. It's not that common for people to experience them. And I will follow Luang Por Sumedho's lead, and the advice he got from Luang Por Cha on this topic is that oftentimes if we haven't experienced them yet, most of the meditation teachers won't broach the topic, because you have to experience them to know what they are. And if you read about them and start talking about them and asking about them, you're kind of giving rise to desire for something in the mind, and there's no way you can possibly conceive of what it is if you haven't experienced it. So you're going to create an image in the mind, and then you're going to try to make that image that you created out of your own memories and imaginations, you're going to try to make that a reality. And it's not possible to lead to a good result. We just end up tying ourselves up into knots and getting completely caught up in desire for something which we don't really know. But when Luang Por Sumedho asked Ajahn Chah about absorptions, Ajahn Chah replied, never mind the jhanas, cultivate the 5 factors of concentration. So basically you're working on the causes, and the causes are something we can all work with during this retreat certainly, but if you're practicing at home and even incorporating, just developing mindfulness during your daily lives. So these 5 factors of concentration are, in Pali, they're vitakka, vichara, piti, sukha, and ekaggata. The various translations can be found, but the first 2 come a bit as a pair, vitakka and vichara. Vitakka is like applying attention to the meditation object, or lifting the object of meditation and presenting it to attention. You can look at it either way. It's basically kind of bringing those 2 together. And that's what you do every time you sit down and you decide what your meditation object is going to be. And I use the breath. Don't take it as an obligation that you have to work with the breath. If something else works for you, please use that. But the instruction is the same. You can translate from one object to the other. So when you bring the mind back to the sensations of the breath, that's kind of bringing it back as the vichara. It's like placing this in the center of the field of attention, in the center of the focus. And then vichara is the ability attention has to stay with that. I think you've probably all been able to watch that already in the first 2 days of the retreat. How we can be sitting here and think, oh, gone again, come back. And just reestablish awareness on the breath, only for it to go right away again. And so that movement of just bringing attention back to the breath, that's vichara, vitakka, and vichara is learning to find how to maintain the interest in the meditation object, because that's what's going to help hold it there. So we bring the attention back to here and now, and then it doesn't just stay there because it has nothing better to do. It has something better to do, that's why it keeps leaving. So we need to learn the skills of how to bring it back. Notice when it's gone, bring it back, and then how do we help maintain it there? And so that's done both by starting to recognize why the mind leaves all the time, and it's partly because it's interested in something else, and because it's not interested in the breath. It finds it boring, and we need to learn how to change that balance, how to make the breath interesting, how to make it more interesting than whatever it's wanting to chase after. And as we learn to do that, and we learn to kind of develop this some sort of continuity, and at first it comes by little bits, but as we learn to prolong the amount of time that we're able to stay with the breath, sort of following a whole in-breath, being there as it flips and starts breathing out. There's the out-breath, and then sometimes the in-breath starts right away, and you notice if you've been sitting for a while and the body is relaxed and rested, and the breathing slows down, and you can even help it a little bit by breathing a little bit slower, a little bit deeper. The body still gets all the oxygen it needs, but it's kind of a little bit easier to follow because you're just helping it increase a little bit, breathing in just a little bit deeper, and then allowing the out-breath to go. And then at the end of the out-breath, sometimes it's happy to just stay there for half a second, sometimes 5-10 seconds before the next in-breath starts. And as we learn how to stay with that, stay with the whole in-breath, notice the beginning, the middle, the end, the changing of sensations, and then it changes to out-breath. The out-breath begins, it's the middle of the out-breath, and then it's the end of the out-breath, and it peters out. Stay with that pause, and then notice as the in-breath starts again. And we learn how to stay with the whole process. So the sensations of the breathing keep changing, but we're learning how to just be with it and stay present with it and accompany a whole out-breath, a whole in-breath, a whole out-breath, the ending, and then the beginning of the next one. And as we learn to kind of stay with that, there's a pleasure in the mind that starts arising from this continuity that starts developing in the presence, this ability to be present. Partly it's a sort of wholesome sense of pride, like we're teaching ourselves a new skill and we're getting it, and it makes us feel good about ourselves, so that's part of it. But part of it is also just the mind is finally resting. It's not running all over the place. And that ease, that rest that we start tasting in the mind, it feels quite blissful because it's a break from all the restless running around that the mind is usually up to. And then because the mind is its own source of energy, it kind of energizes itself in the process. And this leads to piti. Well, these two terms, piti and sukha, in Pali, they're talking about happiness. And again, different people translate them differently. But piti generally is described as a kind of a little bit of a more energetic, some people say coarser type of happiness. Sometimes people get kind of thrills in the body. Some people's the tears just start running. Others get waves of energy going through the body. It's maybe a more physical kind of happiness. And then as we keep staying in the present moment with the object of meditation. So we can get distracted by this. If we get distracted by it, then we've stopped cultivating the cause, and then the result, which is piti, kind of start disappearing. So that's also part of the learning. So we learn to come back to the breath, vitaka, learn to re-establish this presence, develop continuity, vichara, And then piti starts arising, and don't go looking for thrills and waves of energy and tears and stuff. It might not happen. But if it does happen, don't worry. This is the way it expresses itself. But then as we stay, as we maintain that sense of presence here and now, it's almost like all we have to do is kind of come here and look after this being with the breath here and now. And whatever distractions arise, we may notice them, but we're not interested. We're staying with this. So it's not that distractions don't arise. They may arise. What we're interested in is this. And as we stay with this, then the whole picture, the whole landscape in the mind starts very gently kind of calming down. And this sense of happiness gets more refined, and that's when we start experiencing this kind of a deeper sense of peace that feels more expansive as well, which is referred to as sukha. And all of this, the whole time, what we're coming to is this one point in here and now, in the present. That's what they call ekagata, one-pointedness. And again, it does not mean one-pointedness at the exclusion of everything else. So it's we're not necessarily trying to develop an exclusive kind of concentration. Notice when Luang Por's talking about here and now, it's like this. He does this very often. So it's an accepting, an inclusive, openness, and yet we can still be centered on this one point. In Latin, the Latin root of the word concentration means with the center. But being with the center doesn't mean we have to shut out the periphery. It just means the periphery is fine. Whatever happens there, happens there. This is where we're staying. This is where we take our stand, here and now. So in the practice, we learn to develop that. And it's very useful to kind of look at how we're addressing these 5 points in the practice to see sometimes we can just be sitting here and every time the mind goes, we bring it back. And it's a bit like an old post-it that you've used for too long. You put it up on the wall and it just falls right off. So that's the vitaka, you're putting it there. But the glue is too old, it doesn't stick anymore. Vichara can't happen. So then we need to investigate. And that's a factor of enlightenment, Dhamma Vichaya, investigating states of mind, investigating what's happening. So we need to do that and start ask yourself questions. That's what investigators do, right? They ask questions. So ask yourself questions. What's happening? Where does the mind keep going? Why won't it stay? Is it because the breath or bhutu or whatever it is we're coming back to in the present is not interesting enough? How do we make it interesting? How do we stay with it? Maybe we can stay with it for a little bit and then it goes off again. Well, can we extend that? How do we do it? Take it as a challenge and kind of ask yourself questions and learn to understand how the process works. So when we're doing this, coming back to this question, is the knowing that we practice similar or different to concentration or absorption? If we're working on this, we're cultivating this knowing here and now. Coming back to the center. That's the most important part of the practice, is this knowing. Ultimately, that's the refuge and the only refuge we have, but that's what we're cultivating, coming back to knowing the present moment the way it is. And that knowing is the important bit. So that becomes one of the aspects of what's happening in concentration. And even if the mind goes into absorption, that knowing doesn't disappear. If the knowing is gone, then we've drifted, zoned out, gone to sleep, phased out. it's something, but it's not practice anymore. So that knowing is absolutely part of that practice. And sometimes the mind can get absorbed, and sometimes it doesn't go deep enough to get absorbed, but it's still good practice. But I'd recommend that you don't sort of allow yourself to get too fascinated with jhanas, the rupa jhanas, the arupa jhanas. There was a question about how to use the notion of neither perception nor non-perception in daily life. It's an absorption. You don't use that in daily life. You don't go to work and talk with your colleagues out of neither perception nor non-perception. Just keep it simple. And if you cultivate these 5 factors of concentration, it'll lead you where it leads you. You can't go wrong with that. And in terms of all these different levels of concentrations, I think it was Ajahn, the Japanese monk who ordained with the first wave of Westerners with Ajahn Chah. He asked Ajahn Chah one day, how much samadhi do you need? And Luang Por's answer was, just enough. So another question is to please explain how to trust the awareness. That's a good question. I think I referred to that a little bit yesterday evening. Awareness is always here. It's always here and now. And it's like that threshold of the house that we keep passing all the time. It's there, but we don't notice it. So, trusting the awareness, that's going to be an emotional relationship to awareness. It's not something you get to through thinking. We use thinking to guide our understanding, our investigation, but really what we're doing is we're looking. So when Luang Por says, trust the awareness, trust is is something that happens on a gut level. And it's something that develops in a relationship to someone or something like awareness over time because we feel safe. I remember spending my 5th Vasa at Wat Nong Papong with Luang Por Liam, who's my preceptor. And I'd been there for a couple of months already, and one day I just started kind of being amazed at the sense of love I had for Luang Por Liam, love and trust that had developed over time. I mean, at the beginning I didn't know who he was, and over the years I got to know him, spend time with him, live with him, and suddenly there I was, kind of sometimes just overwhelmed with this kind of pervasive sense of love and trust for him. And I felt a bit guilty because I never felt that from my parents. And I was But then also it made me think, because why didn't I feel that for my parents, and why do I feel that for him? And I realized I've never been around him, seen him, heard him, or heard of him doing anything that has ever made anybody feel afraid. He never speaks out of anger. He never acts out of anger. He's completely free and open with all the requisites that come to the monastery, so that you never have a sense that when you're around him you have to hide good things that you have because maybe he sees it and he wants it and he'll pinch it from you. And any time he does teach, and it's not always verbal teaching, sometimes it's kind of just showing by example, he's always pointing out what's in our best interest, his disciples' best interest. So there's nothing that happens there that gives rise to fear. Also the things that he does give us in terms of Dhamma are always for our benefit. Whether we understand it or not, that's different, but it never comes across as a threat. And I realize that's why I trust him, because I never ever felt threatened or afraid around him. Ever. And so when Luang Por started talking, I think he's been saying it for a long time, maybe I just started paying attention to when he said trust awareness, I start relating to that type of relationship that I discovered, I experienced with certain senior monks that are absolutely and totally harmless. So what is it about awareness that can give rise to this trust? If that's what Luang Por Sumedho keeps encouraging us to do, what is it about awareness that is trustworthy? And so you start paying attention, and you start paying attention to where we allow the mind to roam and wander. And every time we're chasing after stuff, we get caught up in life, we get hurt, we suffer, we feel disappointed, we get angry, we get depressed. Even things that make us happy, they don't last, so they're not trustworthy in that way. And then again, investigating, noticing what happens when we go out into the world and invest ourselves into experiences. And what happens when we come back to the awareness? Do we suffer there? Do we meet disappointment, anger, disruptive types of desire, jealousy, hopelessness, despair, all these emotions? And you realize every time you come back to awareness, you may be aware of these emotions arising and ceasing, but awareness isn't ever angry, isn't ever depressed, confused, jealous, greedy, upset. The awareness knows them as sankharas, but awareness is free. Awareness just knows. And it's just wide open. And if we learn to notice that, how coming back to awareness always brings us to this point of freedom where we can know states of mind, but the knowing isn't any of the states of minds that arise and cease. That knowing is free from suffering. Suffering may arise and cease, but the knowing isn't suffering. The knowing knows suffering is a condition that arises and ceases. So, how do we learn to trust awareness? Well, by looking at that, noticing that, and start realizing this is one of the qualities of this knowing, of this awareness, that's not all tangled up with sankharas, is that it's safe. So if we pay attention to that, we start noticing that kind of nourishes the sense of trust. But we need to pay attention. Because I could have lived with Luang Por Liam and without paying attention to him, and then I would have probably never noticed that he was trustworthy. But the more I paid attention, and once I noticed that he was, I started paying more attention, and in every time I paid attention, it reconfirmed how harmless he is, how trustworthy he is, how there's never any sense of danger coming from him when I'm around him. So noticing awareness and then looking at this. This is how we nourish this sense of trust and awareness. And as we learn to trust it, then you do run into situations at home, with your relatives, with your friends, with colleagues at work, in life in general, where somebody says something or behaves in a way that can make you feel really angry. But you come back to the awareness, and you're aware that there's a situation that has given rise to anger. But coming back to the awareness is safe for you because you don't get caught up in the anger, so you don't get burned by the anger. But then because you're not touching this hot stuff, others don't get hurt either. And saying, taking refuge in awareness is then not just a safe thing for us, it's also, by taking refuge in awareness, we're giving safety to others as well. There are a couple of more pragmatic questions. I'll just sort of answer those briefly as well. Someone is asking if it's okay to take supplements and things like that that make us stronger and help sustain health. That's perfectly okay. Someone is asking about a pain that they experience in their upper back, in the shoulder blades while meditating. How to correct that? Well, I hope the session between 4 and 5 o'clock with yoga took care of that. If I'm sleepy, is it okay to have coffee and tea? Please, by all means. Now, there are quite a couple of questions about someone was asking about how to do mindful sleeping and mindful dreaming. Keep it simple. Start with mindful waking. And when that becomes strong, the mindfulness will spill into the sleep. But start with the easy bits. And when another one was asking about suffering from noisy sleeping environment, snoring. I was kind of expecting that one. It's a good question because we love sleeping. It gives us a break from the body, it gives us a break from the thinking, the remembering. It's basically restful. And as with everything we like, we don't like it when it's disrupted. But it's interesting to watch how we can actually lie down with someone snoring in the same room, in the same dormitory, and notice how we can create a lot more suffering by getting upset with it and thinking it should be otherwise. And so maybe you can do something about it if you can ask around. Maybe someone has these, what do you call them? Earplugs, yes. Some of them might have foam or wax or something like that. That might help. But some people are really amazing snorers. And even a solid pair of earplugs, it'll dampen half of it, but half of it is still coming through. I've discovered that it's actually a wonderful opportunity for practice because basically you can't do anything else, you're stuck with it. So I asked myself if I really want to kind of make my own life miserable by getting angry about the snoring, about the person snoring, and all these thoughts come up, trying to fix it, trying to fix the person who's snoring or find solutions to it, blame, arises in the mind. And it's a very good opportunity to practice getting out of the way of harm, of these harmful thoughts and considerations that are arising in the mind. And sometimes I actually have some very pleasant meditations with this 5 factors of concentration. So when you notice, just come back to the body, to what your body feels like, your breathing feels like, lying on your back, on your side. And come back to the body, and then learn how to stay there, and notice how the snoring is something the mind goes out to. And we can come back here, stay with the body, and then the snoring is in the periphery of the field of awareness. And as we do that, as we're able to just stay with that, we don't get caught up, we don't go and disturb the snoring, as Ajahn Chah would say. The snoring is just doing what it does, it's noise. And if we're not busy obsessing with it, but we're able to come back here and learn how to stay here, piti sukha arise and you feel happy. So even if you're not sleeping, you're happy, you're resting, the body's lying down. And you can actually find some rest with that. It's certainly more restful than getting angry all night and getting upset with it. But it's really it's a very good opportunity to notice how we tend to allow the mind to go out to things that disturb us in our environment. And there's this very nice story of one of the old generation Kuba Ajahns of Thailand, and I think he was one of the generation of monks who were disciples of Luang Por Man. I think it was Luang Por Put, but I'm not sure. Anyway, he was old already. He'd received a meal invitation from some people, so he went to their house. It's one of those old traditional countryside Thai houses on stilts, 2 stories. And after the meal, because he was elderly, he needed a bit of rest before heading back to the monastery. They invited him to just take a rest in the house, and they'd kind of curtained off a little section of the lower floor for him to rest behind. So he's there lying down, not sleeping, just resting. And there are these 2 ladies sitting in the corner of the room, talking quietly. And someone goes up the stairs, stomp, stomp, stomp. It's kind of these wooden houses, and you learn how to walk on wooden floors in ways that are quiet, where you put the tip of the foot down first, and then you lower your weight on the foot rather than attack your step with a heel. And so this person went upstairs, stomping all over the wooden steps, making a lot of noise, and these 2 old ladies started complaining about it and saying he doesn't know anything, he should know better than do that, and they were going on. And after a while they hear this voice coming out from behind the curtain, and Luang Por Put saying, "If you go and put your mind on the steps, of course he's going to walk all over it." So notice that, if you're snoring, notice how sometimes we tend to do that. We tend to allow the mind to go out and obsess with the snoring. If we come back here, the body is peaceful, and then we can allow the snoring to be something that's just part of the soundscape, but we don't need to get upset with it. So there's this one question about coming back to investigation. The teaching is to investigate ourselves, our pain, while we're doing sitting meditation. Are we supposed to investigate, or rather look at it, scan it, and let it go? And if we are investigating, it will create more thoughts and suffering. We need to learn to recognize thinking and realize what thinking is, what it's useful for, and when it gets in the way. So the Buddha's teachings are made of words. Like Luang Por this morning, it was very interesting. It's the first time I ever heard him talk about the first three fetters and refer to Vicikicca as language. Usually the translation of Vicikicca is doubt. And so far, when he talks about doubt, because he was a very great doubter in his younger years, a great thinker too, and he realized doubt comes from thinking. And so I really paid attention to that because he says it so often. I figured there must be something there, and then just watching doubts that arise in the mind. Doubts do come from thinking. And when we attach to questions that arise in the thinking mind, sometimes we don't find an answer to them, and we try to figure out an answer through thinking. And we can't get out of it. We've basically dropped into a hole of thinking, and we're trying to use thinking to get out of thinking, and it doesn't work. Thinking is a very useful tool, because if we didn't have language and thinking, we wouldn't have the Buddha's teachings. So language and thinking can be very useful. But if you look at how the Buddha talks about wisdom, he talks about these three levels of wisdom. There's wisdom on the thinking level. So the Buddha's teachings are about wisdom. We hear them. He always encourages us to remember them, to commit them to memory, not just hear in them and delight in them and forget about it, but commit them to memory and rehearse it so that we can make it our own. So he gives us good thinking. Take it in and make it your own good thoughts as well, your own good thinking. And then we use these teachings of the Buddha. We use the guidance he gives us, the encouragements, the pointers, and we use it to look at what's happening here. And that's where we develop a second level of understanding of wisdom, where we compare what he's pointing at and how he explains things are to our experience, and we realize we have a different way of relating to our experience. It's not like what he says. What the Buddha teaches comes from a different point of view. So he's talking about the same thing. When he's talking about suffering, we all know what he's talking about. But he says it's a noble truth. It's something that we need to learn to accept and understand. That's not what we usually do. So he's looking at suffering from a different angle than we usually are. And so we learn to use his pointers, to use his explanations, to try to understand what this angle is from which he's looking at things. The angle from which there is freedom from suffering. Whereas the one we usually operate from, a sense of self, we get caught up in suffering. We take it personally, fight with it, get caught up in it, and fall into it. What he's pointing to is a way of looking at it that allows us to be free from suffering. So this is the second level of wisdom where we're bringing it in. And we're still using this verbal, this language, the thinking, in order to point towards what's happening here and to understand experience and understand what's impermanent, that what arises does cease. Sometimes when suffering arises, we have the impression we didn't notice it arise. All of a sudden we're suffering and we have this notion that it's never going to end. And he's reminding us, no, it does end. What is of the nature to arise is of the nature to cease. But we need to pay attention and notice when there's no suffering. And then all of a sudden suffering arises, and because we're paying attention, we're noticing the absence of suffering, and then suffering arises, and we stay with it, and then we notice that it ceases, and then we know for ourselves, yes, this is true. So we're using this language, this verbal teaching, the thinking that we've memorized to guide us to this understanding. And as this becomes more and more our way of looking at things, we learn how to take this point of view the Buddha is speaking from, understand what it is, and learn to look at things the same way as the way he's talking about. Little by little, our understanding of our experience changes. And little by little, we relate to experience less and less in terms of me, experiencing happiness and suffering, and more in terms of it's just Dhamma, it's just nature. Happiness is like this, suffering is like this. So it's not about me anymore, it's just what it is, it's just the way it is. And then as this becomes, little by little, the point of view from which we learn to look at things, from that point of view, when we look at things, naturally we see them for what they are. And that is the third level of wisdom, is this intuitive, what Luang Por calls intuitive wisdom, or this point of view from awareness. And the word intuitive, the way Luang Por uses it, is not the commonly used way of talking about intuition, this kind of sixth sense that a lot of people kind of don't believe, it's not scientific, it's not rational. When he talks about intuitive awareness, it's this level of understanding and knowing, in contrast to the first level, which involves thinking and language. So the thinking and the language is a pointer. It's pointing to a direction. It's pointing a way of how to look at our experience. And once we learn how to come there, to this place of awareness, we can start trusting that. From that place of awareness, we look at experience, we start understanding it's all sankharas arising and ceasing. You don't need language for that. Once you learn how to recognize things for what they are, then the direct looking doesn't need language. It's like there was, this afternoon during the sitting, there was some bird song out there. The experience of hearing, we know we're hearing bird song, and we don't have to call it bird song, and we don't have to know what kind of bird it is, and I don't need to tell you about it. You can hear it, listen to it too, and hear it directly. I can tell you, I can ask you, oh, can you hear that bird? And the words I'm using, language, thinking, are pointers to an experience. So these teachings of the Buddha, these encouragements Luang Por offers, these encouragements I'm trying to offer, they're pointers. But they're pointing to an experience. So when we're investigating pain, notice how we can think about it, we can overthink a situation or how to deal with it, but on the level of experience, investigate that, investigate what's happening at that level, at the level of knowing this body. Scan the body by all means, because when you scan the body, what you're doing is you're kind of putting in the center of there are two ways of looking at it. You can say you're placing your attention on a certain part of the body, or you're putting that part of the body in the center of your attention. Doesn't matter which way you look at it. But you can, as you practice like this and you notice sensations of the breath in different areas of the body, you realize that you can actually choose where you place your attention. That's what a huge part of the practice is about. Developing the freedom to choose where we place our attention and how we place it. And then when the pain arises, if we're still getting caught up in the reactions of not wanting, resisting, it means vibhava tanha has arisen, desire not to experience the pain, and we go and grasp the pain to try and get rid of it, and we're stuck with it. So we need to investigate, what am I doing here? What is it that's happening? And then use the exercises that we practice with the breath. Notice how you can place your attention easily on different parts of the body when everything's hunky-dory, comfortable. You can watch the sensations of the breath at the nose, in the throat, in the chest, in the belly. Sometimes the whole body. There's a subtle sense of expanding and contracting with the breath. And so attention is free to go and look at the sensations of the breath pretty much anywhere, and then pain comes to visit, and everything goes sideways. Because attention just goes to that and starts obsessing with it. And then thinking kicks in, and thinking makes a bigger mess of it. So how do we develop the freedom to bring back attention to another part of the body? And that's investigation. You can use thinking to guide. Remind yourself, oh, here we go again. I went and grasped it, so how do I let go of it? How about coming to some other place? It's language, it's thinking that we're using to guide awareness back to another part of the body. You come back to watching the sensations of the breathing here. What is the pain like when you're here, and stay with this? What is it like when you go back there? And notice what happens in the mind. And learn how to develop this freedom in the ability to choose where you're placing your attention and how you hold it. Again, vitakka. Attention has just gone there, so when you bring attention back to the breath, that's vitakka. Vichara, how do you hold it there? They're the same 5 factors of concentration again, but we're developing this ability to choose where we're placing our attention, and we use thinking to guide the process. One person is asking for advice. When noticing the breath, I tend to end up controlling the breath. It's something I think everybody probably experiences. The breath is a very, very interesting object of meditation because we can control it to some extent. Breathe in deeper, slower. But a big part is out of control as well. Like Luang Por was saying, we can't just breathe in forever because we prefer in-breaths to out-breaths, so I'm just going to breathe in, leave it at that. We don't have that control over the breath. And so it says something about our relationship to this body. How we can use the breath to investigate this relationship to the breath, but it's also the same relationship to the body. Because I can control it some, I assume it's mine. But then when we look at the fact that we don't decide to breathe, breathing happens and we can influence it a little bit, but mostly it happens on its own. It's not self. And when we don't pay attention to it, it just does what it has to do. If we're relaxed, the body breathes at a certain cadence. If we're going upstairs, it quickens. And we don't have to ask it to do that, it does it automatically. When we're asleep, it keeps breathing, it doesn't wait for us to tell it to. So it's not self. It's a natural process. And because we're connected to this body, we can interact with it. We can hold our breath, we can breathe faster, slower, but eventually it goes back and does its own thing. And so it is interesting watching the breath, noticing that relationship of me, my breath, and my wish to control it. And then sometimes we want the breathing to feel good, but it doesn't feel good, so we're trying this, that, and the other. And it's very interesting to use that. Allow it to be what it is. Allow this sense of sometimes not knowing for sure if it's mine or not mine. It's just, notice how that's just the habit of creating a sense of self, grasping something and making it me. That's what you're witnessing. And then investigate that. Try holding the breath and just see how long you can hold it, and eventually you can't anymore. The body lets the breath out and starts breathing again. It's out of control. And then watching the breath, like I was suggesting yesterday afternoon during one of the meditations, noticing how the breath feels in different areas of the body. And if you notice one area of the body where the breath feels comfortable, feels light, stay with that, indulge in it, and enjoy it. And that enjoyment kind of allows the body and the mind to relax. And because we're taking pleasure in the breath, and the mind attention tends to stay with it more easily. But then other times we can't do that. We're sitting here and you just observe the sensations of the breath in the whole body, and most of it is neutral. A couple of places feels a bit tight, but there's not a place in the body where it actually feels nice and pleasant and relaxed. And so use that. That's where investigation comes into the practice, and it's an absolutely crucial, it's one of the factors of enlightenment. We need to learn how to do this, investigate that. So try controlling it, and then try just letting it go and stepping back, and notice the desire to try to influence it or breathe in better so it's more comfortable. But notice how the breath is still just doing its own thing, and we can actually let go, and it keeps breathing. The body keeps receiving oxygen, it stays alive. And when I do that, I end up feeling very grateful to the breath, because I never asked it to do all this work, and it's been 50 years now that it's been breathing about 20,000 times a day, or whatever it is. And you just feel grateful that the breath is giving us life. And then we can use it. So it's not so much controlling it in a kind of egotistical way, but we do have the ability to influence the breath. So notice as you're breathing and watching the breath, sometimes we can sit and feel very relaxed, but the body is a little bit kind of closing down on the breathing mechanism. And we can't breathe in very deep because we're kind of slightly hunched. Sometimes the head drops, and makes it even worse. So notice when you kind of tilt the hips forward a bit, the whole back sort of straightens up. Rather than letting the head drop down, bring it up. And you can even very slightly pull your shoulders back, and you're just opening the whole breathing mechanism. And then the in-breath feels more invigorating, more noticeable. And if you just choose to breathe in a little bit more, and then on the out-breath just let it go gently, you're making the breath a bit longer. The sensations of the breath are more prominent, it's a bit longer, and how we breathe influences the body. How the body feels influences the mind. There's a very strong connection between the two. And you start realizing we can use the breath to help the body, to help the mind. We can use the breath to calm down the body. We can use the breath to calm down the mind. I won't go into the details of it, but if you read the Anapanasati Sutta, where the body talks about using Anapanasati, the 16 steps, it just starts with that, noticing short, shallow breathing, noticing longer breathing. And he's not saying one is better than the other, but noticing them. They are different. And then it goes into calming the body, into calming the mind, and then into liberating the mind, all from the breath. So we can use this ability to influence the breath, use it for your own benefits. If we're cultivating knowing, then why is it that when attention wanders away from the breath, we practice returning to the breath? If the key is in the knowing and not the object, then we can practice continuing to know with the new sense objects. It's true. But our habit, our ordinary unenlightened way of functioning is running after objects and getting caught up in them, investing into the relationship we have with the objects. If they're pleasant, we want to hold on to them. If the experience of an object, physical, one of the senses or mental, is unpleasant, we resist it, we try to get rid of it. So we're usually relating to objects coming from desire. And if we just come to the breath, and then when the next thing comes, we go with that, and the next thing comes, we go with that, and we keep moving from one to the other, we're not actually giving ourselves a reference point from which we can observe what is moving us, why we're moving from one thing to the next. The reason we move from one thing to the next is because we like stuff. So we move towards things we like, and then we bump into something we don't like, so we go into the other direction. And then we're not developing any understanding. And because we're always moving, we're not noticing what is the motive, force behind that movement. So that's why we come back to the breath, because the breath is basically neutral. And if we stay with that, and then we notice the mind goes off to something, we can just come back to the breath, or we can also be, as we notice where the mind has gone off to, just ask yourself, without getting too caught up in it, because the point is coming back to the breath, to this reference point, but do notice, what was in it for me there? I was doing some of that this morning, and the mind just comes up with the most amazing garbage. I mean, it's embarrassing. And yet it's just one thing after the other. And I was noticing, because in a way I'm coming from a busy period of time, so coming into this retreat, we're all experiencing the same thing. Kind of coming from busy lives, family lives, work, and all of that. I've been traveling for months with Luang Por, and the last 2 weeks in Bangkok were quite busy, socially speaking. And organizing, planning, traveling for oneself is already busy, but when you have to do it for your teacher, who's an elderly person who you love and want everything to be the best for, it involves a lot of thinking, planning, and dealing with things, with people. So I come here, I sit down, the mind doesn't stay on the breath. It's just going off to all kinds of things. Some of them are related to that, other things is just absolute nonsense. And I was just watching what is it, even in the worst kind of nonsense, the things that make no sense at all, where the mind just jumps from one bit of a story to another bit of another story, exactly like in your dreams. You know, when you've had a dream that you remember in the morning and you tell, oh, I had a dream last night, and you have no idea why it started, where it started, and why halfway through the story it jumped to something else. But that's what the mind does. And this goes on in the mind sitting here. And so I'm watching that, and I'm watching why the mind goes there is because whatever the content of the story is, there's something entertaining about it. It's a story. And what if this? And what if that? And it's all conditioned by how we perceive ourselves, who we think we are, who we want to be, who we don't want to be, the things that we like that interest us, the things that don't. And with all these myriads of factors, these stories arise, and we take a pleasure in getting involved in the storyline and tweaking it and adjusting it, and maybe it's more fun this way, maybe it's more interesting that way, and it all kind of happens on its own. But the thread that's leading us through all of that is the fun. It's fun daydreaming. And so, if we don't have the breath to come back to, if we don't have this process of, this is what I'm trying to do, but it keeps doing that, why? Coming back to the breath is giving us a reference point and revealing a certain picture in the mind, and we can start investigating what's happening in the mind. We don't get to notice these things, we don't get to investigate things if we're just going from one object to the next. After a while, yes, when we start trusting the knowing, and the knowing does start becoming our reference point, then whatever arises and ceases can be known. But then, by then, usually what tends to happen is that we've practiced coming back to the knowing so much that we're here and now, and there is already a sense of stillness that becomes our new norm. Like Luang Por says, he doesn't need to practice meditation anymore. The natural state of the mind is present. Awareness is the refuge. And there's staying power there. He's with it. He's firmly established in that, and that is what provides the stillness. And because that stillness is where he's at, anything that arises and ceases in the stillness automatically becomes what is impermanent and recognized as a sankhara. But if we don't have that foundation of stillness, then every time something arises, we go off after it. So that's why we need to use this, using these meditation objects as a reference to teach us the difference between what is here and now and what's not. To recognize the knowing in contrast to the sankharas, and to recognize why we keep leaving home to go out into the world, because we like it, or we dislike it and we want to get away from it. My mind doesn't wander, however, it just remains blank, no thoughts, just aware of surrounding, not self. How do I progress from here? Just remaining blank seems like a waste of time. There's no investigation going on. So stillness serves no purpose on its own. Like there's this very, very beautiful quote, it's probably my favorite quote in the suttas, where the Buddha talks about the heart of the practice. We don't practice for the sake of praise and gains and fame, for the sake of developing purity, for the sake of developing concentration. We don't practice for the sake of wisdom, we practice for the sake of liberation. So we usually we keep moral precepts, we follow the guidelines of don't do these 5 things, these 5 precepts, which are the basis for all other levels of precepts. Avoid doing these things because they create remorse in the mind. And if there's remorse that arises every time we remember things we've done and said, the mind won't settle. So they're kind of prerequisites for the mind to settle, to become still. And then we use these practices of meditation to deepen that stillness. And we develop the stillness for the sake of being able to see clearly what is changing. And we observe and investigate what is changing for the sake of understanding it and letting it go. And in that letting go is where the freedom happens. So if you're sitting and just experiencing stillness, but everything becomes blank, then you need to come back to investigating. Start with the body, investigate the relationship to the body in terms of its nature, of what it is. The 32 parts, the fact that it's a thing that is born, that's made of food, like Luang Por likes to remind us, and that dies. It follows its own nature. Is that the way we relate to the body? Luang Por Liam has a very, very beautiful way of talking about sickness. It kind of highlights how we usually relate to sickness. The way we usually relate to sickness, we say, yeah, there's something not right, there's something wrong. And Luang Por Liam says, there's nothing wrong. Sickness is what the body does, it's doing its duty. And that's an understanding of the body that arises from knowing the nature of the body. The nature of the body is to be born, grow up, get old, it gets sick along the way, and eventually some sort of sickness is the cause of the end. That's what bodies do. Is that the way we see the body? Watching the nature, learning to investigate the nature of the mind, use the 5 aggregates, body, feelings, memories and perceptions, thoughts, emotions, views, and how we experience consciousness through the 5 senses. Use the 4 foundations of mindfulness. There's an absolute, it's like Alibaba's cave of wonders in terms of investigation. Use that. So don't let the mind just go into the blanking out. It means you've already probably reached enough peace, enough tranquility. Put it to use to start developing wisdom and understanding. So maybe I'll just do one last one. Oh, this one's good. Venerable Ajahn, I'm interested to know how to blend meditation for Theravada with Mahayana or even Vajrayana. That's mixed salad, huh? They're all different tools. The whole, like I was just saying, the point of the Buddha's teaching is for liberation from suffering. The shortest possible way he's ever described his teaching is he teaches suffering and the end of suffering. Whether you want to walk up the mountain along the steep side, climb up the cliff side, take the slow winding road around, or build a helicopter and just fly straight up to the top, that's up to you. That's what these different traditions are. They offer in different ways of approaching it, but all these different traditions have the 4 Noble Truths as the core. Whatever works for you, do that. But then don't shop around too much, because every time we start one thing and move to the other, then we lose time because we're not building consistency in developing a certain way. So choose one, stick with it. Okay, I think I need to stop here.